Every hour of your life has 60 minutes. Every minute has 60 seconds. Every circle you draw has 360 degrees. You did not choose those numbers. Someone chose them for you roughly 5,000 years ago, and you have been living inside their decision ever since, without ever knowing their name. They had no forests, almost no stone, no iron in the ground beneath their feet. They lived on a flat, scorched floodplain between two unpredictable rivers, surrounded by marsh and desert. By every measure of geography, these people should not have survived. And yet they did not merely survive. They invented the world you live in. Their name was the Sumerians. And for nearly 4,000 years, the entire planet forgot they had ever existed. To understand how they did what they did, you have to begin with the land itself. Because the land is the reason. Southern Mesopotamia, the territory between the Tigris and the Euphrates, is not a place that invites settlement. Summer temperatures push past extremes. Rainfall is scarce and savage. When it comes, it does not arrive gently. It crashes down in walls of water, floods the plain, and vanishes, leaving cracked, pale earth behind. The two rivers, for all their life-giving power, are dangerous. Unlike the Nile, which floods on schedule, the Tigris and the Euphrates surge without warning. They change course. They swallow fields whole. They erase villages in a single season. The land swings between drought and catastrophe in a cycle so brutal, so relentless, that the Sumerians wove it into their deepest mythology. In their telling, the gods once sent a great flood to destroy all of humanity. Only one man survived, a figure named Utnapishtim, by building a great boat and loading it with the seed of every living thing. Thousands of years later, that story would surface again in the book of Genesis as the tale of Noah. But beneath this hostility lay something extraordinary. Over millennia, those rivers had deposited deep layers of rich, fertile silt. The soil of southern Mesopotamia was among the most productive on earth, if and only if water could be controlled. And that single condition, the need to master water, changed the trajectory of everything. It forced a decision no human society had ever made before. To survive here, you could not plant seeds and wait for rain. You had to cut canals across miles of terrain. You had to build embankments to contain the spring floods. You had to dredge silt from waterways season after season. And you had to do all of this not as a family, not as a village, but as a coordinated network of thousands. The irrigation systems the Sumerians constructed were colossal. A single city-state managed an agricultural zone of roughly 300 square kilometers, crisscrossed by canals, dotted with reservoirs, covered in carefully watered fields. And those systems required constant maintenance. Miss one season of dredging and the canals silted up. Miss one season of repairs and the embankments collapsed. The rivers did not forgive negligence. This is the hidden engine behind the birth of cities. Not ambition, not invention, necessity. When survival depends on a system this large and this fragile, someone has to organize it. Someone has to assign labor, measure water, schedule maintenance, resolve the disputes that inevitably arise between the village upstream and the village downstream. From that necessity, authority was born. And at the center of every Sumerian city, rising above the flat plain like a man-made mountain, stood the ziggurat, a stepped temple tower that was never merely a place of worship. It was the administrative heart of the city, functioning simultaneously as a temple, a granary, a tax office, a courthouse, and in some cases a textile factory. The priests who managed the ziggurat controlled the land, the water, the surplus grain, and the labor schedules. They set prices. They collected taxes. They distributed rations. In the eyes of the Sumerians, all land belonged to the gods. The priests merely administered it on their behalf. By around 3,800 years before the Common Era, the village was no longer the dominant form of human settlement in southern Mesopotamia. The city had arrived. The greatest of these was Uruk. At its height, between 40,000 and 80,000 people lived within roughly 10 kilometers of walls. For creatures that had lived in groups of 20 or 30 for hundreds of thousands of years, this density was entirely new. In a village, life was governed by familiarity. You knew every face, every family, every old argument. In Uruk, that system collapsed. Each day, a person moved among thousands of strangers. Social order could no longer rest on personal relationships. It required institutions, and institutions require records. In a village, you can remember who owes what to whom. In a city of 50,000, you cannot. The birth of writing was not inspired by poetry or prayer. It was inspired by accounting. The earliest known written records, clay tablets from Uruk dating to around 3,300 years before the Common Era, contain no stories, no myths, no songs. They are inventories, tax records, wage ledgers, lists of sheep, lists of barley, units of labor. Writing began as bureaucracy. Before these tablets, the Sumerians used a simpler system of small clay tokens, a cone for 1 unit of grain, a ball for 10, a large cone for 60. But as the economy of Uruk grew more complex, storing thousands of physical tokens became unmanageable. Temple officials made a decisive leap. Instead of keeping the tokens themselves, they began pressing them into soft clay to record the information. The physical object was replaced by its image. Representation was born. From there, the evolution was rapid. The pressed marks became simplified drawings. A picture of a head meant head. A picture of a bowl meant food. A picture of a foot meant to walk. At first, the system was vast and clumsy, more than 2,000 separate signs. But over centuries, the Sumerians discovered something that would transform all of human communication. Symbols could represent sounds. The Sumerian word for arrow was ti. It had a specific written sign. But once the system shifted toward phonetics, that same sign could be used wherever the sound T appeared, regardless of meaning. Suddenly it was possible to write full sentences, grammar, abstraction, nuance. The complexity of spoken language could now be captured in clay. Scribes used a reed stylus, pressing it at an angle into soft clay to create wedge-shaped marks. We call this script cuneiform, from the Latin for wedge. It became the dominant writing system of the ancient Near East for over 3,000 years, adopted by the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, and dozens of other cultures. And clay, it turns out, was an ideal medium. Unlike papyrus, which decays, unlike parchment, which burns clay when fired, even accidentally in the blazes that destroyed the very cities where it was stored, becomes nearly indestructible. More than 1 million cuneiform tablets have been recovered. Archaeologists are still finding them. They tell us more about daily life in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era than we know about most of medieval Europe. The Sumerians did not merely invent writing. They produced an astonishing volume of innovations, so deeply embedded in our daily lives that we have long forgotten where they came from. Their numbering system was based on 60. Why 60? Because of how they counted. Instead of using all 10 fingers, the Sumerians counted the 12 segments of the fingers on one hand while using the 5 fingers of the other to track groups of 12. 5 times 12 equals 60. From that simple gesture, counting on their own hands, they built a mathematical framework that still governs your day. 24 hours, twice, 12. 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute, 360 degrees in a circle. Every time you glance at a clock, check a compass, or measure an angle, you are using a system invented in southern Iraq 5,000 years ago. Their mathematics extended far beyond counting. They could solve quadratic equations. They calculated the area of triangles and the volume of cubes. They understood the relationship between the sides of a right triangle, a principle we now call the Pythagorean theorem, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. They invented the plough, which allowed fewer people to produce more food, freeing labor for craftsmanship, trade, and administration. They invented the wheel, first as rollers for heavy objects, then as mounted wheels with axles, then as the basis for carts and chariots. They were the first to build with arches and columns. They invented the sailboat, turning rivers from obstacles into highways. They created the first known legal codes, centuries older than the famous Code of Hammurabi, covering property, trade, marriage, inheritance, and criminal offenses. And then there was beer. The Sumerians developed the first known brewing process, fermenting barley into a thick, sweet, unfiltered drink consumed through long reed straws from large communal jars. Beer was not a luxury, it was a dietary staple, and likely safer than city water, since the brewing process involved boiling. They even had a goddess dedicated to it, Ninkasi, whose name translates as the lady who fills the mouth. The hymn to Ninkasi, written around 1,800 years before the Common Era, is essentially the oldest known beer recipe, praising the processes of malting, mashing, and fermentation in poetic verse. They invented soap, mixing animal fat with ash and lye. They created the first schools, where students studied reading, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and literature. Education is not a modern invention. It is a Sumerian one. When the people who invented writing encountered disease, they did what they knew best. They recorded the symptoms on clay and began looking for patterns. When a Sumerian fell ill, 2 people came to see them. The first was the ASU, a practicing physician. He examined the body, checked the pulse, measured temperature, studied the color of the skin and urine. He prescribed herbal salves, compresses of oil and thyme, tinctures dissolved in beer and honey. The oldest medical tablet in the world, a clay slab from Nippur dating to roughly 2,200 years before the Common Era, contains 15 specific prescriptions. Pulverize branches of the thorn plant. Pour diluted beer over it. Rub with vegetable oil and fasten the paste over the affected area. No incantation, no ritual. Pure applied pharmacology, 2,000 years before Hippocrates. The second healer who came to a sick Sumerian was the Ashipu, an exorcist, because for the Sumerians, illness had a dual nature. Yes, it had physical symptoms, fever, pain, swelling. But behind every symptom lay a cause, and the cause was the intervention of invisible forces. A demon had entered the body. An angry god had sent punishment for some forgotten sin. The task of the Ashipu was to determine which force was responsible and banish it through incantations, amulets, and ritual. What is remarkable is that both systems operated in parallel, and neither was considered inferior to the other. The ASU treated the body, the Ashipu treated the cause. The patient received both a herbal salve and a prayer. This was not contradiction. For the Sumerian mind, the physical world and the spiritual world were a single fabric. To treat the body without addressing the spirit would have been as strange as treating a wound while ignoring the fever it caused. Sumerian medical records were so detailed that scholars can now identify descriptions of nearly every major disease known to modern medicine. Their herbal catalogue listed roughly 340 different medicinal plants, organized from head to toe, from diseases of the skull, through the torso, down to the feet. The first medical reference book in history was organized in exactly the same way as a modern anatomy textbook. Sumerian medicine was directed at one thing: keeping a person in the world of the living. But their burial rituals suggest that the boundary between life and death was, for them, permeable. A king did not simply die. He crossed over. And in the vision of the Sumerians, his court crossed over with him. In the 1920s, the world saw exactly what that belief looked like in practice. British archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient city of Ur in southern Iraq when he uncovered something that changed how we understand the ancient world. Beneath the surface lay a royal cemetery containing roughly 1,800 graves. Most were simple, a body wrapped in a reed mat, a few possessions beside it. But 16 of these burials were different. They were enormous underground complexes, stone chambers with vaulted ceilings, approached by ramps cut deep into the earth. Inside, the dead were surrounded by treasures of breathtaking craftsmanship: golden helmets, necklaces of lapis lazuli and carnelian, silver lyres, jeweled daggers, delicate floral crowns made entirely of gold leaf, and a mysterious inlaid box depicting scenes of war and feasting in vivid mosaic. But the treasures were not the most disturbing discovery. It was the bodies in the pits surrounding the royal chambers. Woolley found rows of soldiers in copper helmets holding spears near the entrance. Women in elaborate golden headdresses arranged in neat lines. Musicians still lying beside their instruments. Ox-drawn carts with grooms positioned at the heads of the animals. In the largest of these, which Woolley called the Great Death Pit, 74 bodies were found. 6 men and 68 women, all arranged in careful order, all dressed in ceremonial finery. The bodies showed no signs of struggle. The headdresses were undisturbed. It appeared they had walked into the pit, sat down, and died. Woolley believed they had taken poison voluntarily, choosing to accompany their king or queen into whatever lay beyond. But recent CT scans of 2 skulls revealed something darker. Pre-mortem fractures, caused by a blunt instrument. For some attendants, it seems, the poison was not enough. Those who did not die quietly may have been struck to ensure that no one was buried alive. Among the dead, one woman stood apart. Her name was Puabi. A cylinder seal identified her as a queen. Her crown, layered rings of delicate golden flowers, ribbons of gold, and beads of lapis lazuli, remains one of the most stunning objects of the ancient world. And in the pit beneath her chamber, her entire court lay silent, dressed for eternity. What the death pits of Ur reveal is something important and uncomfortable. The civilization we inherit was neither humane nor gentle. It was effective, and the very same institutions that fed people and educated their children, that invented medicine and law and poetry, could also demand that 74 human beings walk into a pit and lie down beside their queen. The same clay that carried their hymns also recorded their cruelties. This is the nature of civilizations. They contain everything. For centuries, the Sumerian city-states existed in a state of near-permanent rivalry. Each city had its own walls, its own patron god, its own army, its own dynasty. Alliances formed and collapsed. Borders shifted. Kings rose and fell. No single ruler held power long enough to unify the region. Then came Sargon. His origin story reads like a myth, and perhaps partly it is. Born to a priestess who could not keep him, the infant was placed in a reed basket sealed with pitch and set adrift on the Euphrates. A gardener found him on the bank and raised him. As a young man, Sargon entered the court of the city of Kish as a cupbearer. What happened next is unknown. The clay tablet that contained that part of the story is broken. But when the record resumes, Sargon is king. He did not merely conquer, he transformed the very nature of power. Before Sargon, war was between cities. After Sargon, war was between systems. He replaced the heavy Sumerian infantry formation with a faster, more flexible army of archers and soldiers carrying bronze axes. He marched south through Sumer, defeated the reigning king Lugal-Zagassi, and in a gesture of calculated humiliation, paraded him in chains through the gate of the great temple at Nippur. Then he turned north. He pushed into Syria, east into Elam, capturing its capital. His empire eventually stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, the first multi-ethnic state in recorded history. To administer it, he appointed governors across the provinces, stationed garrisons in conquered cities, and built a new capital called Akkad in a location that has never been found. The city that ruled the world's first empire is still lost somewhere beneath the soil of Iraq. But to conquer is not to unite. Sargon's empire spoke two languages: Sumerian in the south, Akkadian in the north. Two peoples, two ways of seeing the world. The sword could force them to submit, but it could not make them feel like one. For that, Sargon used not his army, but his daughter. Her name was Enheduanna. Sargon appointed her as high priestess of the great temple at Ur, the most powerful religious position in southern Mesopotamia. But Enheduanna was far more than a political instrument. She was a poet of extraordinary force. She composed hymns and liturgies in two languages, Sumerian and Akkadian, the languages of her father's empire. In doing so, she helped forge a common cultural identity between the conqueror and the conquered. But her most remarkable works were personal. She wrote in the first person. She described her own emotions, her fear, her suffering, her devotion, her fury. As far as we know, no one had ever done this before. When a political rebellion forced her from her temple and into exile, she wrote directly to the goddess Inanna. I, who once sat triumphant, was driven from my sanctuary. I was forced to flee like a swallow. My life is consumed. I approached the light, but the light scorched me. I approached the shade, but the clouds covered me. This is not a government record. This is not a hymn recited by a committee. This is an individual consciousness pouring itself onto clay. The birth of the lyric voice, the beginning of literature as self-expression. In the marshes of southern Iraq, before the pyramids of Giza were complete, a woman invented the idea that personal experience was worth recording, that an individual's inner life mattered enough to be written down and preserved. Every memoir, every diary, every poem that begins with, I traces its lineage back to her. But her father's empire lived not by poetry, but by force, and the next generation proved that in full. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, went further than his grandfather. He declared himself a living god, the first ruler in Mesopotamian history to claim divinity, and adopted the title King of the Four Corners of the World. Under his rule, the Akkadian Empire reached its greatest extent, but empires carry within them the seeds of their own collapse. The centralized system that functioned under strong rulers became brittle under weak ones. Environmental stress, likely a severe drought, destabilized agriculture across the region. From the mountains to the east, a tribal people called the Gutians began raiding the plains. Within a generation of Naram-Sin's death, the empire that had unified the known world ceased to exist. The Gutian occupation was a catastrophe. A mountain people unfamiliar with the intricate irrigation systems of the plain. They let the canals deteriorate. Agriculture collapsed. Cities were abandoned. The civilization that had taken thousands of years to build began to dissolve. Only in the remote, swampy south did traditional Sumerian life continue more or less undisturbed. Around 2,120 years before the Common Era, a Sumerian king named Utu-Hengal of Uruk drove the Gutians out. Power then passed to the city of Ur, and a ruler named Ur-Nammu founded what historians call the Third Dynasty of Ur, the last great Sumerian kingdom. Ur-Nammu set about rebuilding. He restored the canals. He constructed the great ziggurat of Ur, a massive stepped temple to the moon god Nanna, whose ruins still rise above the Iraqi plains today. He compiled one of the earliest known law codes, and his administration developed a bureaucracy so detailed that we know more about the economy of Ur in 2,150 years before the Common Era than we know about most kingdoms of the medieval period. But the revival was fragile. Over-irrigation had slowly poisoned the soil with salt. Crop yields were falling. From the west, nomadic tribes called the Amorites were pushing into Mesopotamia, disrupting trade routes. From the east, the old enemy Elam was growing bolder. In 2004 years before the Common Era, the Elamites sacked the city of Ur. The fall was so traumatic that the Sumerians wrote a poem about it, the Lament for the Destruction of Ur, in which the gods themselves are described as abandoning the city. Temples are looted. Mothers flee with their children. The dead lie in the streets. The poem does not try to explain why it happened. It only records how it felt. And how it felt was like the end of the world. With the fall of Ur, the Sumerians ceased to exist as a political entity. The Amorite dynasties that followed, most importantly Babylon under Hammurabi, inherited their cities, their gods, their writing, their mathematics, their literature. The Sumerian language survived for centuries as a scholarly and religious tongue, much like Latin in medieval Europe, before it too fell silent. And then something extraordinary happened. The world forgot them entirely, because the Sumerians built with clay and mud brick. The Egyptians left behind pyramids impossible to ignore. The Greeks left marble temples on hilltops, visible for miles. But Sumerian cities, over centuries, crumbled into low mounds indistinguishable from the desert itself. Their civilization literally dissolved back into the landscape. You had to start digging to realize that an entire world lay beneath your feet. For nearly 4,000 years, no one knew the Sumerians had ever existed. It was not until the 1800s that European archaeologists digging in the deserts of Iraq began pulling clay tablets from the earth and realized, slowly, with growing astonishment, that they were reading a language older than everything, older than Greek, older than Hebrew, older than Sanskrit. A people erased from human memory was being reassembled from the fragments of their own records. What we found in those fragments was not the skeleton of a primitive society. It was the architecture of our own. Consider what you have inherited without knowing it. You tell time using a system the Sumerians built. You measure angles and circles using mathematics they invented. When you sign a contract, you are participating in a tradition of written obligation that began in the temple archives of Uruk. When a doctor examines you from head to toe, they are following a diagnostic sequence first described on a clay tablet in Nippur. When you read a poem written in the first person, you are reading in a voice that Enheduanna opened 4,000 years ago in the marshes of southern Iraq. When you pour a drink at the end of a long day, you are performing a ritual the Sumerians would have recognized instantly, though they would have insisted on sharing it from a communal jar through a long reed straw. But what the truth may be, if you look deeper, is something stranger than mere inheritance. The Sumerians did not simply give us tools and techniques. They gave us a way of organizing reality itself, the idea that the world can be measured, that obligations can be recorded, that suffering can be written down, that a single human being's inner life matters enough to be preserved in clay and carried forward through millennia. These are not technologies. They are orientations, ways of standing in relation to time and knowledge and each other. And they came from a people who had no stone, no iron, no forests, only mud and water and the long, patient pressure of necessity. If you look deeper still, you find something that the history books rarely mention. The Sumerians were not merely practical. They were also dreamers. They wrote hymns to the stars, careful and precise observations of the night sky, recorded across generations, building the foundations of what would become astronomy. They told stories about gods who descended from those stars to teach humanity the arts of civilization, knowledge that was too important, too strange to have come from ordinary human minds. They called this gift the me, the divine laws, the fundamental principles that made civilization possible. Writing, mathematics, music, law, the art of being a city. In their mythology, these were not human inventions. They were gifts from the heavens, entrusted to humanity at the very beginning of time. Whether you read that as theology or as metaphor or as something else entirely, something older and stranger than either, the feeling beneath it is recognizable. It is the feeling that what the Sumerians created was too large, too improbable, to have emerged entirely from human effort alone. A people with no natural advantages, on an unforgiving plain between two dangerous rivers, with nothing but clay and time, built the foundations of the world you live in. They built cities when no one else had cities. They built schools when no one else had writing. They built hospitals when no one else had diagnoses. They built empires and then watched them fall, and wrote poems about the falling. And then they disappeared so completely that for 4,000 years the rest of humanity continued to live inside their inventions without knowing whose hands had made them. Tonight, as the dark settles around you and the world outside goes quiet, let that thought move slowly through your mind. Every hour you have ever lived has been measured in a system that someone built 5,000 years ago on a floodplain in what is now Iraq. Every circle you have ever drawn has been divided using a counting method invented by people who are counted among the most forgotten in all of human history. The clay tablets are still coming out of the ground. Archaeologists are still finding them, still reading them, still learning what was pressed into wet clay by hands that turned to dust long before your civilization was born. There is something deeply calming in that thought if you let it settle. You are not at the beginning of something. You are somewhere in the middle of a story that started long before you arrived and will continue long after you are gone. The Sumerians are proof that even the most complete forgetting is not permanent, that what is buried does not disappear, that the marks pressed into clay in the firelight of an ancient city can wait patiently in the dark for 4,000 years and then speak again, clearly, to anyone willing to listen. Let the image come to you slowly, if you like. A night in ancient Uruk. The stars overhead are enormous and very close, the way stars only look when there are no electric lights anywhere on the earth. A scribe sits in a room lit by a small oil lamp, pressing a reed stylus into soft clay. He is recording something ordinary, a count of grain, a list of workers, the kind of record that fills most of the tablets we have found. He does not know he is inventing something. He does not know he is making the first step in a chain that will eventually reach all the way to you, lying still in the dark, thousands of years away, breathing slowly, listening. He presses the clay. The marks harden. The city sleeps around him. The rivers move in the darkness beyond the walls. And somewhere out there, beneath the vast and patient sky, the world waits to become what it is becoming. Where are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment and let me know. I always find something quietly extraordinary about the fact that someone in Tokyo or Buenos Aires or a small town I have never heard of is lying in the dark thinking about the people who built the first cities, who invented the first words, who looked at the same stars you are looking at now and decided somehow that all of it was worth writing down. Let your breathing slow. Let the image of that ancient city soften at the edges, the ziggurat rising against the night sky, the canals catching the starlight, the scribes and priests and merchants and musicians who filled those streets with a sound we will never quite hear again, but can almost imagine. The Sumerians are gone, but what they built is everywhere around you, in every clock you have ever read, in every law you have ever trusted, in every word you have ever written, in every story anyone has ever told in the first person, beginning with the word I. They are present in all of it, quiet and patient and permanent, the way that only very old things can be. Sleep well. The tablets are still in the earth. The story is not finished.